on Trump days, you'd say if a politician stood up and said, let's focus on the 2 trillion economy as opposed to the behemoth south of the border, is the head screwed on correctly? Like, where are your priorities? It's always let's sort of strengthen the north-south linkages.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Hey, hello everyone. It's Warrington Ellicott once again from the Canadian Association of Importers and Exporters on the Simply Trade Pod, brought to you by the guys at the Global Training Center. And my very special guest here today is the very famous Canadian attorney Ryan Manucha, who's written this fantastic book. I have it here, and it's called Cigarettes. Cigarettes and Constitutional Dust. It's booze, cigarettes, and constitutional dust-ups. Now, I guess the first question is, what the hell how did you come up with the title of the book?
Oh, Warrington, it's so wonderful to be here. And you're right, booze is always at the center of these interprovincial trade battles, The most recent one being about Gerard Cuomo trying to bring a trunk full of beer.
Yeah, this very famous Canadian guy who was a beer drinker got busted bringing beer back from New Brunswick. Okay, all right, well, we'll get to it.
Yeah, you always have booze. The messaging is don't touch with Canadians alcohol. The second you do that, you're in hot water.
Well, I mean, for all the listeners here, this is going to be somewhat Canadian centric in our discussion today, but it's a prime example when you're trading internationally. Traders must always be cognizant of subnational government intervention in a thing. It could be a regulation, it could be a label, it could be a policy where you have prepared your article to go on an international basis, but then you get tripped up by, I call them gotchas. You have these little gotchas that show up in a subnational region, which will prohibit your good or service from being put on sale. So I guess let's get into it. So, I mean, the listeners would think about Canada as this one nation, cold and snowy, but really it behaves like 13 individual markets. And so why don't you give the listeners a little bit of background on how Canada's constructed and how we ended up in this mess?
Yeah, no, it's highly similar to the way that the U.S. is constructed. With it's underpinned by federalism. You've got a national government, but you've got subnational governments with a great degree of constitutional authority to implement legislation and regulation. And in Canada, you've got 10 provinces, 13 territories, and the ability to erect regulatory fiefdoms if done so. Right, nothing is necessarily stopping that. And so it comes down to, hey, just because you have that authority, we've got to use this wisely and in harmony with our relative national counterparts. In the U.S., the big difference between Canada and the U.S. is a number of reasons. There's more continental states, so the competitive forces amongst the states sort of inculcate a greater and Warrington, you and I we can debate this back and forth. I'm sure you've seen a lot, but greater the competitive forces creating greater unity, but also I would say that the constitutional law in the U.S. is much stronger at striking down interstate trade barriers than the equivalent in Canada. And so that's a big difference between the two.
I see. And you've done some research as well. You've sort of come up with the economic issue, the number that this is impacting Canadians, right? And it's not insignificant. It's huge, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're Canada, a $2 trillion economy, and the impact of internal trade barriers up to if not more, $200 billion a year impact to the GDP, 7.9% growth boost to the GDP if we were to, a maximal policy intervention. And I even think, Warrington, I think the $200 billion is a lower bound. But The numbers help paint the picture that, we're in no way, with the rhetoric with Trump and Canada, are we, trying to replace you can't replace the 340 million, the most vibrant economy in the world. But part of the discussion has been, hey, there is this, inward orientation that we can kind of find some unlock.
And I guess, our legislators and regulatory traders in Canada are now coming aware of this number. But I've been at this a while, and in my history, I've run into this constantly in the complex article sector. And getting to reform in this place has been excruciatingly difficult.
Yeah.
And why is that?
I think it comes out in normal days, non-Trump days, you'd say if a politician stood up and said, let's focus on the 2 trillion economy as opposed to the behemoth south of the border, is the head screwed on correctly? Like, where are your priorities? It's always, let's sort of strengthen the north-south linkages. And now, the internal trade, because some of them are thorny. And, there's a great quote, former CP Rail CEO not too long ago going, hey, there's this movement towards longer and heavier trucks. And every time they get bigger, it makes it harder for us to compete. There are stakeholder groups that sort of like the status quo. And so I think that when you're looking at gaining as a political operative, you're probably looking for where, maybe let's expand in Massachusetts or California first.
But we have regulations, like if you have a certain type of truck, you can't even take the truck from Vancouver to Nova Scotia without either modifying the truck or having different things on the truck. Like, this is ridiculous, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it augments the cost of transportation. It costs $6 to ship a good from, box of, confectionery from New York, from California to New York. It costs $6 to ship it across Vancouver. It costs $13 to ship it, Vancouver to Toronto. So, some of it is the geography and the way we've laid ourselves out. But a lot of those costs, the cost of the patchwork nature of interprovincial trucking, augmenting the cost to ship by about 8.3%, which translates to higher costs of goods on the grocery store shelves.
This is nuts. So getting back to the book. So the first poster child of the book is booze. So I think we should talk about Gerard Como, because I think he's sort of the motivation and behind the book. So why don't you give us a description of his case and how it all shook out?
Mm-hmm. So it was a wonderful, beautiful fall afternoon, 2012. Gerard Como departs his house in rural New Brunswick for the Quebec border, 2.5-hour drive. And he did this for 3 or 4 times a year. He would buy booze on the other side of this provincial frontier because he was a rational economic agent. It was cheaper to do so. And, he had the time. So he would do this. And this fateful fall afternoon in 2012 crosses back into New Brunswick. But he is apprehended, detained, and all of his booze confiscated at the border by the RCMP, the Mounties. And what had he done? He'd brought in more than the provincial limit. He and 17 others that day had broken the same law. And what was the limit at the time? It was 12 bottles. And he had closer to 12 cases. So, the guy... Yeah, you gotta stock up. Winters are long out there. And so he found himself a willing lawyer. He pointed to the Constitution, the Canadian Constitution, which says that, paraphrasing, goods should be able to move freely across provincial borders. And he says, what do you mean? Like, it literally says this, like, as an American listening to this and reading that provision, the American originalism sort of mindset would be like, yeah, textually, originally, this is what it says, but has not been interpreted that way. For over 100 years. And so he was sort of fighting to get that reimagined. He ultimately lost. And the Supreme Court of Canada went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, who said, no, there was sort of something else going on, and you can, to steal, whatever, to do the argument that New Brunswick would have justice. They said, our revenues that go towards hospitals and roads, we're very, very dependent on the revenues from sales of alcohol. And, if folks like Cuomo are going across into Quebec, how are we going to pay for our doctors? This is important. This is how we've constructed ourselves. And an American audience would understand, hey, local government should be able to sort of regulate in light of local circumstances. And if New Brunswick has decided this is how we'd like to construct our society, this is how we sustain our institutions that matter, who are we? Who is the rest of Canada? So it's this tension, and Americans are all too familiar with the tension of the national interest versus the interest of a state, or in Canada's case, a province.
Right. And then New Brunswick also, like, they continued to fight this tooth and nail, right?
Yeah, fought it
almost
tooth
up
and
to
nail.
this year, right? Yeah.
Yeah, 6 years to the Supreme Court, and then they fought it ever since. All the other Canadian governments felt the heat in the aftermath of the decision, and they said, okay, well, we got to unlock internal trade on booze. So they all lifted their interprovincial trade caps, except for New Brunswick. New Brunswick kept theirs in place until, as you say, they took the Trump election and his bellicose nature with the tariffs for Premier Holt to say, hey, New Brunswick's also dropping its interprovincial booze limits. So it takes this, but Canadian history is rife with this, where it takes a foreign government to get our house in order.
And the other areas that you document in the book is also around aspects of labor mobility, right? And certifications and licensing and mutual recognitions of accreditation, right? So even if you're an accredited professional in one province, you are literally precluded from conducting the same trade in another province until you went through their provincial whatever requirements at additional cost, time, effort, and so on and so forth, right? Like there are many, many examples in the book that you detailed. And then you've also made some comparisons between the behavior of the Canadians in the United States in this regard and Australia. And I think you should touch on a little bit of Australia, because they introduced a new model, which I think Canada looked at and is going, this is a good idea. So you might want to explain that.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, credit goes way back to the Europeans at the end of the 70s. And then, Australia looked at the Europeans, and now we're looking at the Australians. So it's this whole chain reaction. I always underscore to regulators, hey, like, we're not the first ones to this table. So the concept is mutual recognition. If it was approved for use and sale in another province or another state, it's good enough for us. We're not going to create duplication. We're not going to layer in our own requirements, whether it be goods, services, or labor. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for us. And Australia went through this round of, they were feeling the heat of globalization, I think very much, in the early 90s. They were in the same situation Canada finds itself now, where we're dropping off the productivity tables, the prosperity tables, like our future ability to have a stable political environment. I think we can all think, hey, just because we have one now doesn't mean we have one forever. We have to really be careful. And so the Australians instituted these reforms. They went farther than what Canada is imagining today. All the states got together and said, hey, if you're a security guard licensed and certified in Queensland and you move to New South Wales, you got to notify the local regulatory authority, deposit your documents and your certificates of good standing, all this, but you're deemed recognized as a security guard. Versus the model here, where for a long time, and still in many provinces, and still the status quo essentially in Canada is deposit your stuff. Oh, we might ask you for your high school transcript. We'll endeavor to get back to you. And here now, we're aiming towards there's consensus around a 30-day service standard. If you compare that to the 0-day service standard in Australia, like we have work to do. Nova Scotia is pushing the envelope at a 10-day service standard. But when it comes down to the ability, like there's the ambition level, like, hey, we already have, and American listeners would be baffled to know that Canada's internal trade arrangements were so embarrassing to the country in the early 90s that we said, we're going to erect a domestic free trade agreement. So we have this for 30 years. We have a trade agreement on how to trade within ourselves, right?
Yes, the very famous Canadian Free Trade Agreement, CFTA, as we would call it. It lives in the archives. It's got a hell of a lot of dust on it, but not much practical.
And we have an internal free trade court, the WTO, and we've domesticated that because we were like, So the point being, hey, if we're going through this reform process, this once in a confederation opportunity, this legislation has got to do the right thing. Let's move the needle here.
Yeah, but riddle me this. We have, I'll talk a little bit what I know about it, in that we have an Energy Efficiency Act, right? We have a federal act that not only controls the border. So if you produce a product, it must meet this federal requirement. And that federal requirement also controls interprovincial commerce. So if you import the document, say to British Columbia or Alberta or wherever, it still has to meet this federal requirement. But riddle me this, why are there 5 provincial individual energy efficiency acts with bureaucracy all behind that? This makes no sense. 0 sense, right?
Yeah, yeah, and it begs the question. Right now the rhetoric with Prime Minister Carney and the government, the federal government now is, hey, we're going to remove the federal internal trade barriers by Canada Day. For those who are not dialed into the file, the rhetoric is, hey, we're solving internal trade by Canada Day. But the problem is that the federal government is a central government. The folks in the United States will understand a central government has dual response. Yes, there might be internal trade barriers that spawn from their own measures, but there's also this requirement of a central government to coalesce and coordinate amongst subnational jurisdictions to help them aggregate. So in Australia, for example, within the first 2 years of their reform, their mutual recognition reform, 15,000 Australians engaged in that apparatus to get to the other side of the internal border. But over the first 5 years, 20 occupations went to some form of national standard because the regulators were in such constant communication with one another because of the requirements under the legislation and regulations for this measure. They were like, well, okay, the friction was so evident, the discrepancy is so evident. They're like, okay, I think I understand how you guys do it. You understand how we do it. We can get to a common standard. That's what Europeans do all the time. Common standards, right? And mutual recognition is that pathway, that vehicle that gets everyone onto the same plane because, it really comes down to the individual. I'm sure you've seen it. It really comes down to an individual being able to say, I trust that pressure system or that good, and if you have individuals who are proactive and forward thinking and engaging with the science, you get that. But some there can sometimes be that tendency to hold back and.
Yeah, and in practical terms for the listeners, this is happening real time in Canada right now. There is a bill before Parliament. It's called Bill C5, and you can look that up in the House of Commons. And this is the Prime Minister's vision to try and fix all of this. And so what the vision behind this bill is to try and get the federal government out of the way in terms of free trade and labor mobility, but it's also to add some stability and structure behind removing of barriers for major infrastructure projects. And there's a debate going on in the House of Commons and right now to this thing. What I can say and comment on the bill is with respect to the application of things like the Energy Efficiency Act, it doesn't make any sense. Like this makes no sense, and it doesn't solve our red tape problem with respect to the 5 provincial governments. But anyway, the bill is happening now. It looks like it's going to go through Parliament very quickly. They want to get it done by July 4th, and traders should be paying attention to this because obviously if this does go through, there's going to be a set of regulations that will accompany this, and that will impact traders in all kinds of sectors, like goods producers, transporters, freight forwarders, you name it, that Canada is going to be changing, and hopefully to the better, right? I mean, that's where this bill is headed. But I don't know if you want to comment. There was I think you met the Premier Ford and you spoke to Vic Fideli, and that Ontario introduced Bill number 2. And I would submit, I think the provincial bill from Ontario is probably the one with the most aspiration. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean that, and we can't forget that Nova Scotia. I think even Ford himself will credit Nova Scotia for the credit.
Right,
but yes,
that was Bill 9, which was an act to reduce interprovincial trade barriers across Atlantic Canada. But I think they've somewhat regressed since the original introduction of the bill. But I think the willingness was there, right? Like the motivation, right?
Yeah, and quite frankly, in the federation in Canada, like the lion's share of barriers emerge from provincial regulation, because especially if they're discrepancies. So yes, and it's been tough to try to get buy-in. There's the tension between arguments around tension between public safety and then the interest of prosperity and growth. And I try not to let great be the enemy of good on these things. One emergent concern I do have, Warrington, is that we're trying to rally around like making it easier to trade, but we're seeing various forms of legislation on internal trade across the provincial legislatures. They're all kind of like looking at it and doing it differently. So if I'm a trader, it's, well, what is the definition of mutual recognition over there versus there? And one thing for traders too is it's not unconditional mutual recognition. It is mutual recognition if another province passes similar equivalent legislation, essentially. So then there's this question. Okay, Nova Scotia, who have they deemed equivalent? Who has Ontario deemed equivalent? Who has BC deemed equivalent? So you almost have to create these mental mappings of where are the arrangements in place and green lighted, and where are they not? And when it's at Nova Scotia 10 days, and then Ontario in some cases it's 30 days, and in some cases in Alberta it's 20 days for the turnaround time on service standards. So this is where as much as we really push for sort of furthering this, like the fact that we're furthering it in kind of different flavors is for me as an observer a concern. And this is where a federal government does have a responsibility to come in and sort of, perhaps coalesce and create, model legislation potentially to demonstrate to others what it could look like.
Yeah, I mean, old habits die hard. I was looking at the Quebec. Quebec recently introduced the Bill 102 for those in the know here. There are exemptions in that bill you could drive a transport truck through. Like to your point, equivalency and mutual recognition here could go off the table if the regulator deems, well, I'm not going to play in this game. I'm going to go to do it different.
The same thing is true with the federal bill, as you saw. I'm sure it's a lot like, this is in theory, but a lot of discretion is still accorded to federal regulators to say, the provincial equivalent of this is good enough. So, or isn't good enough. So we're going to keep ours in place and make sure you maintain,
And I think in my experience too, what drove my experience at the Regulatory Cooperation Council level within North America was these continued advancements of energy efficiency standards at the provincial level. Like they were all trying to one-up each other. And the producers could not produce an article for 5 different little provincial markets. Like it was not practical, and it wasn't physically going to happen. And then there was some consensus, at least when the U.S. NAFTA was negotiated and USMCA and the Regulatory Cooperation Council came together. That's when we got regulators and stakeholders together at a table to hash all this out and come up with one consensus, right? Like one test procedure, one laboratory process, one certification approval, mutual recognitions of accredited laboratories and standards and labeling. And so this is, I guess the point is this is hard work.
Yeah.
Right. It is a hard work, and it takes time. And so as listeners will agree, these are tenuous times in trade. And traders are actively looking their markets and where their exports and imports are headed and coming from are changing. And discovery of regulatory misalignment is critical to ensure that these goods keep going. So, all right. So I guess put your thinking cap on in here. Like, what's the outlook, and where do we go from here?
I think that you're going to start to see some provinces, like I'll just take the example of Nova Scotia, the Eastern Canada, population of about 1 million, but extremely innovative in their approach to regulatory reform. And they are using this moment as like almost more of like a whole of government reflection on how they work. And it's actually broadening out from a mandate of interprovincial trade liberalization to more sort of modernizing their approach to regulatory reform. And you're seeing them, and there's genuine buy-in, at various points, in the hierarchy, but across government, but it's especially from the premier. So I think more generally, we're seeing certain provinces pull out and really, really run with this hard. Nova Scotia, Ontario, as 2 examples. And we may see sort of a subset sort of really sort of take initiative. I think that the heavy, as you said, Warrington, this is not, you've seen it firsthand. This is July 1st deadlines where you have big, all-encompassing, federal or provincial legislation. Great, but there's so much work that sits underneath that. It's just the tip of the iceberg, and it comes down to whether or not are resources going to get reallocated away from this file? Is our first ministers and their cabinets, are they going to reorient away from these topics? You need that continued buy-in. For years, the Committee on Internal Trade, this is a cabinet level appointees from every Canadian government who are focused on internal trade. We're meeting once a year, and now it's been remarkable, once a month, if not more. So can that continue? Because you need that.
Right. I'm still kind of a show me guy on this file, though. There's a number of us who've been on this file for quite some time, and I think my view here is I want to see tangible outcomes, actions. Like I want to see reality happen here fast. So, okay. Well, I guess, folks, and even our U.S. listeners, this is a great practical example of what can happen. It can happen to you. It can happen in your market where your states will drive you crazy and get you into trouble. And, all right. Well, so what's your next book?
Taking suggestions. It's going to be deep dives on whether or not 2025 was where Canada sort of turned a page on its internal economy, narrated by David Attenborough or something.
I see. Okay, well that's great. Well, I can tell you, folks, Ryan's going to be with us at our conference up in Ottawa in November, and we'll dive deeper into this question in more detail. But in the meantime, I know, Ryan, you've been flying around doing a lot of work with the provinces and the premiers, and I encourage you to keep it up. And I think this is a lesson for everyone who's trading at an international level. Don't take your eye off the subnational government ball. And in my case, it's come down to municipal building codes. Believe it or not, that can stop the installation of an article into a home. And it can drive you crazy. So as you're looking at your compliance and regulatory outlook, you need to take a close look at these subnational governments and make sure your products are prepared accordingly. Well, Ryan, look, it's been great to see you once again. I hope to see you soon at an event nearby. And listeners, reminder, our big conference is November 18th through 20th in Ottawa. Ryan's going to be there at the Fairmount. Check us out at iecanada.com, and our salutes to the guy at the Simply Trade Pod and the guys at the Global Training Center. Ryan, thanks for joining me today, and have yourself a good day, everyone.
Thanks so much, Warrington.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.